generalizing. So let me welcome everyone to this webinar of the Special Interest Group for Challenges. And today we have a very exciting topic, which is related to regulatory science and real-world deployment of data. And I have the pleasure to introduce our two great speakers that we have today. We will start with a talk from Ghada Zamzmi, who's a regulatory scientist and an AI researcher with a medical imaging background. And over the past few years, she had rolled in both academia, government, and also industry. And her aim in the research is to bring together the AI expertise, but also the practical regulatory insight to understand the real-world deployment challenges that we face today, and we will hear about that. So she's an active member in MICCAI and NeurIPS and has received several awards, including the MIT Innovators Under 35 and the IEEE Computational Life Sciences Award. So we're very excited to hear your talk. And the second speaker we have is Jean Feng, who's an associate professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the University of California, and also at the UCSF Berkeley Joint Program in Computational Precision Health, and also a principal investigator at the UCF Stanford Center of Excellence in Regulatory Science and Innovation. She's the data science lead of the Digital Innovation Task Force for the Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital. And her research is both about interpretability, reliability, and also regulation of AI in healthcare. So we're very much looking forward. We start with Ghada's talk. And afterwards, you have the opportunity to ask one or two questions before we go to the second talk. But in the end, you will have enough time for questions. So Ghada, whenever you're ready, feel free to share your slides and start the talk.
Thank you, Annika. Thank you for having me here today. Okay, let me share my slides. Do you see my slides? Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's here morning in the East Coast, so good evening or good afternoon, wherever you are. So I am happy to spend some time today talking about a regulatory-driven AI innovation. I want to start by some disclaimers that everything I say here doesn't represent policy or position of my past or present employer. And the goal of this talk really not to discourage theoretical and technical research because it's critical. It's very important to advance the field. The goal is just to give a perspective of what we need to do to bridge the gap between research, innovation, and real-world clinical translation. Okay, so I think every time I go to any conference, like the last one was MICCAI a few weeks ago, like I am really impressed and amazed by the amount of technical innovation we all have. There is a lot of research papers in diffusion models, foundational models. So innovation is going very, very fast. AI innovation is accelerating, but if we just think a little bit, a lot of these models will not leave the lab. Why? The main problem, because there is a huge clinical misalignment between what we're developing in the lab and the clinical needs. We don't have full understanding of deployment challenge and regulatory requirements. So what we need to do something about this. So what I'm trying to present here today is that we need to have a mindset shift toward regulatory driven and clinically aligned approach to AI innovation. We should keep innovating, it's important, but at the same time, we need to start to think about how we will bring this innovative technology to clinical practice. So regulatory alignment is the fastest path to clinical translation. What I'm talking about, it's actually happening. We have been seeing a lot of papers and headlines about real-world failures of high-performing AI technologies. So Google Medical AI Lab, AI was super accurate in the lab. Real life was a different story. We see top AI models fails when there is slight change in the data. So this is a reality that I think one of the reasons we have it, it's because we don't think carefully about how we're going to translate what we're building in the lab into clinical practice or into real world. So what is regulatory-driven AI innovation? It's a mindset that pushes us to innovate with the end in mind. So we need to center the entire AI development to its intended use and the final label. Like, this maybe sounds a bit too much, like, and restrictive for the research side, but this is actually the standard and common practice in the majority of high stakes domains. If we talk about drug development, if you want to design a new drug, you have to think about your final drug label, and then you design your entire process based on this. Same with aviation. Like in aviation domain, if you want to build an autopilot, if you want to design an autopilot, you don't just build the most advanced technology without thinking about your user interaction, how the pilot will interact with it, the operational limits, the environmental tolerance, the failure modes. You cannot build something that you can actually use in airplanes without thinking about all of these things. And one good example that it was actually very scary is the MAX 737. I don't know, but based on what's reported in the media, one of the main causes of the failure of this, because the pilot wasn't trained with this technology. So there was some misalignment between the human using the technology and the technology itself. So what we need to do is we need to innovate while keeping in mind clinical need and patient safety. So it's a regulatory driven AI development. So usually, like, I try to divide this talk based on like the AI life cycle. So we have the pre-development, we have the data collection, development, validation, and post-market monitoring. I can't cover everything because it's just 20 minutes, but I will go over, like, I think the most two critical like component, which is the clinical framing and scoping and the data collection. So for the clinical framing, we should start whenever you have a new technology, you need to start with the label. What is the purpose of this technology? What is the thing we're trying to solve here? We want to solve a real clinical problem to avoid creating solution for problems that don't exist, or like solution that's clinically irrelevant. So think about the problem that your method is trying to solve, and then try to think about what we call it from regulatory perspective, the clinical label, or like the intended use. So what is the intended use? It's what is the AI model objective, like why you're building this, and what is the operational conditions of the AI models? Who is the end user, how they will interact with it, and who is the intended use population? So what is the patient demographics? Like, what is the disease spectrums? Like, if you like want to do like breast cancer disease diagnosis, all the spectrums of the disease and so on. So you have to begin your development journey by thinking about your clinical label. Like, what is the main objective? Like, what is the user involvement in the interaction with the device, and who is the final intended use population? And then we need to define what success is. Like, in the technical machine learning world, it's state-of-the-art performance. It's not state-of-the-art performance when you're building a medical product, when you're building a AI that will be used in patients. Success in like clinical translation, it's your performance has to be clinically acceptable. The AI has to be safe and effective. Those are the main three things. So to measure if your AI is safe and effective, you need to think about like 4 critical questions. Like, what should we measure? Like, what is your endpoints that you want to measure? What is good enough? Like, if we're not chasing state-of-the-art performance, then what is really good enough? What is my acceptance criteria? For whom does it work? Like, we need to think about the subgroup analysis of the people, the patients group, and then how strong is my evidence? So let's start by the first one, which is the endpoints. The first one is what should we measure, which is the clinically relevant endpoints. Like, when you think about the metrics that you want to choose for measuring the performance of your like task, you need to think about the clinical task you're trying to solve. So selecting the endpoint should be grounded in deep understanding of the clinical task and the intended use. So for example, like if your AI models it's a triage device, and the goal is to pick the most critical cases first, then your primary endpoint should focus on the time to notification. This is important. Sensitivity is also important. But then if your task is screening, where you want to build an early stage cancer screening, then the goal is to minimize the missed disease while also making sure we don't add burden to the clinical practice. So your metric will change based on this new goal. So you have to think about sensitivity at pre-specified specificity floor, and then you also need to think about the net benefits. What is the actual benefit this screening tool is adding to the clinic? So there are different tasks, and for each task, the endpoints will change. The main goal here is that we let the clinical task drive the metric selection, not the other way around. There are tools and papers about this. These are two of my favorites. The first one is Metric Reloaded. This is a very nice website that allows you actually to think carefully about the endpoints for your task. So like it's a question-based like website where you go and you start to answer a specific question related to your task, and it tells you if this metric is suitable for your task. And I really highly recommend that you go and play with it. I have used it so many times, and this is their paper. This is also another tool that was established by MEDRIC and FDA collaboration that allows you again it's a tree-based tool that allows you to think carefully about what is the right metric for your task based on like an interactive decision support tree. So another important thing we need to be careful about is the risk-benefit trade-off. Like what's good is not just a number. Like it has to have, like your performance have to have a measurable positive impact on patient outcome. Context matters. Your numbers out of context doesn't mean anything. So one good example is in life-threatening application, 99 accuracy score. Is it really good if 1% of the error will lead to patient death? The cost of error is not uniform. Like one good example is 2 mm segmentation error in lung could be very minor, depending on the task, of course, but it could be minor. But the same error in a different area can be very bad. It can lead to death. So we need to think about that the error is not uniform. It depends on your task. And we also need to think about the population risk and net benefits. Like if I have a model that performs equally well across all my group, so it seems this is good, this is fair, but sometimes this is clinically flawed because you need to make sure your model is more sensitive for the high prevalence cohorts. And actually, this is something I learned when I was working at the NIH. We were building a multimodal system for sickle cell disease, where I was thinking I need to make sure the model is fair and accurate and performing equally well across all groups. And then the doctors, they keep pushing me. In sickle cell disease, the most important group is the Black patient population because they have the high prevalence there. So we need to think about this. And then we also need to think about workflow impact. Does it really help? Does my AI model, even if it's the most innovative technology, does it really add anything? If it slow down care, then there is negative impact there. So, and then we define the endpoints. Now, what is good enough? What's good enough is basically has to be driven from some clinical justification. So you need to define your acceptance criteria based on the device risk profile. As I said, in life-threatening application, your bar is much higher. So you need to understand the risk profile. You can establish your acceptance criteria of what's good enough based on clinical guidelines, based on standard of cares, based on human performance. Like if you have some way to measure the human performance, then you can compare to the human performance. So we also need to think about the acceptance boundary. So we have the acceptance performance, which should be clinically justified, but the acceptance boundaries can be derived from your data. So we can follow a data-driven approach to establish the range for performance threshold. And when it comes to establish what is my acceptable boundaries for the task, it's really, really important to ensure we have good data that allow us to establish those boundaries. So this is again another paper where the authors, they discuss that how the prevalence of the disease shift from my training data to deployment data. So if we started to establish our acceptance criteria based on the development data, and then I deploy my model, I will realize that my model will not pass those boundaries because basically like I build my boundaries and acceptance criteria based on limited data set. So your data, the data that you're using to establish your criteria is really, really critical. So again, like I highly recommend you go and read this paper. They talked about how the prevalence shift from development to deployment. And this is something we need to keep in mind. Sometimes it's really hard to get good data for deployment before you go and deploy the model. So in those cases, we need to think maybe about reasonably using synthetic data to simulate scenarios and span the prevalence band. So this is one good case of basically we can use synthetic data to try to simulate our deployment data. So just to summarize this stage, like high performance is very important, but we also need to make sure our model safely improves clinical decision-making and patient outcome while generating evidence aligned with its intended use. This is really important. Then for the data analysis and preparation, I will try to go quick here. So we know data is critical because AI model are data hungry. So we need very large volume of data, but they're also data driven. Poor data lead to poor outcome. So there is this study that actually evaluated how degrading data quality dimension can impact the performance of a regression model applied to COVID. They use I think they used 7 or 6 different models, and they had 3 scenarios. One where the model learned from corrupted training data, the second scenario where the model evaluated on bad data, and third scenario when the model was trained and tested on bad data. So this is what they find is that poor representation really degrade the the performance basically. So each of these colors represent one of these different regression models, and basically here in case of training, corrupting the training data, corrupting the evaluation data, and here is corrupting both. And we see like there is a degradation in the model performance that's happening when the feature representation is bad, is poor. And then they did the same for the completeness. If my data is not complete, then like they found the same thing, that the completeness does impact the performance of all these regression models. They also did analysis for incorrect feature value lead to performance collapse, and how the target accuracy does impact the performance. Like the main takeaway here is garbage in, garbage out. If your data is bad, your model will be bad. So we need to spend some time actually trying to assess the quality of the data we're using to build our model. So this is a multi-dimensional standardized framework for data quality assessment. It's called metric. They assess data based on if the data is consistent, representative, accurate. They include also metadata. I highly recommend you go and read this paper. The FDA also now, they're moving toward this direction. In their draft, they talked about fit for purpose data and data clusterization using the data card. There was a collaboration between ARBA-H and FDA focusing mainly on building a centralized place where we have high quality data. So data quality and usage, they really have huge impact in the model and the regulatory decision of your AI model. Annotation quality and variability, like it's really hard to assess the model if the ruler we're using to measure it, it's broken. We have to spend some time understanding the quality of our annotations. So the quality of the annotation come from variability among observers. It can come from like error in computer generated labels. Like there's different causes of error. We need to understand what is the cause and we need to do something to fix it. There's many ways to fix it. We can have multiple annotators and then we can combine their annotation together using a method like stable. And this is really important because of really the quality of the data annotation set the performance ceiling for your model. Like we also need to spend some time early in the process trying to understand the main confounders driving our performance and what is the important factors in our data. And then we need to ensure our data set actually has good representation of all these important factors. So this is task specific, modality specific. So in some tasks, the demographic include age, sex, medication, and then we need to think about imaging and acquisition factors, site and selection to make sure we mitigate site biases and selection biases. And so this is a very nice paper that discussed different factors and confounding factors in medical images and how they interact with each other. Doing such analysis early in the process is critical, especially if you want to build a clinical trial. So you need to do causal analysis to isolate true clinical signals from noise and de-risk the clinical trial. You want to build a clinical trial that's actually established on you understanding what is the major factors driving your outcome. And so why we need to make sure our data set is representative and clean and everything, it matters because it allows us to avoid hidden failure mode and because the FDA care about it. Like subgroup analysis performance and data quality, they're really important component of the review process. Sometimes when we want to build a model, we realize we don't have the data. So what can we do about it? So one way to do it, if we cannot do targeted data enhancement, we cannot use synthetic data. We can use synthetic data while being very responsible here and ensuring that the data is actually valid. So this is some of our work where we did some analysis of synthetic images generated using diffusion models and GANs, and we found out those models, they really generate image with that's clinically not correct, basically. So like you see like the shape of the breast is not okay, and in some images there's more than one nipples. So using synthetic data in your model development is important to ensure that you have good coverage, but we need to be careful about it. So invest early in the data quality. It's not just a preliminary step. It's really the most critical value defining stage of medical AI development. AI, they're data driven. They learn based on the data. If we don't have good data, it will really impact everything down the line. So I'm not going to talk about AI model development because I don't have time. So I'm going to skip all of these. So another very quick thing I want to say here is like the internal testing is very important. You cannot go to deployment blind. So you need to make sure you internally test your model very comprehensively before you go to deployment. Otherwise, you will go blind and then you will find things later. I will skip validation and verification. If you want to learn about it, you can read the FDA guidance. And now let's talk just briefly about the long-term model sustainability. So after you deploy your model, it's not the end. It's just the beginning. You need to have a mechanism to ensure your model keeps running, to ensure the sustainability of your model. This is what we call post-market monitoring. Jean will talk about this, so I'm not going to talk about post-market monitoring. She will give like a very good talk on this, I'm sure about this. There is just few things I want to mention is that when it comes to monitoring, we need to be very careful. And one thing is that not every deviation is drift or noise. Sometimes the deviation can reflect natural variability of the disease or the task. And we need to spend some times before post-monitoring to understand the natural variability of the disease in order for us to really be able to define what's really a drift, and then we monitor it. So I will skip these slides and just end here. So to go from paper to patients, we need to have a new North Star. Our North Stars should focus in innovation that's aligned with clinical needs and patient safety. Always start with your label. What is the final label? Like in every other high stakes field, this is how things work. Define the intended use population, the operating condition upfront from the beginning. Measure what matters. Think very carefully about the endpoints. Do a very strong risk-informed plan to help you establish your acceptance criteria. Data quality in terms of the data itself and annotation sets the ceiling really for you. Like if you have bad data, you can have the best model, it's not perform very well. And then build for equity and workflow, like subgroup performance analysis is very, very important. I just want to end by thanking everyone. There's so many people in my career who helped me and contributed to my knowledge. So I am thankful to everyone. So this is a picture with the DITSER group at the FDA. Like there's a lot of people here. Like I think, Jean, you know a lot of them. This is one of the last picture from last MICCAI with Esther, who's also working with me here in Heartflow. And I will end her. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the great talk. This was really interesting, and I think we all now have a lot to do. So we have time for one intermediate question, and would be able to answer more questions at the end. And just one more note, because this question also came up, this talk, both talks will be recorded and will be available online afterwards. So we have our first question here. I will read it out to you. So model performance reported in medical AI papers is often not reproducible due to restricted data access and limited implementation details. I strongly believe our field would benefit from open, standardized benchmarks to enable true comparison between models and rebuild trust and reported performance. What would it take to foster joint efforts between hospitals, academia, and industry to make such trustworthy benchmarks sustainable? It seems like a difficult yet critical challenge to bring models from papers to clinical impact on patients in the hospital.
Yes, and I totally agree with this. I think right now we don't have really good benchmarking or data set for medical AI devices. We have it for like research purposes, but not for development purposes. So what it takes, I think it takes a lot of collaboration between regulatory agencies, academia, industry, to help building a standardized like marketplace, like index, like I mentioned it briefly, the collaboration between ARPA-H and FDA. The goal of this collaboration actually is to build a one centralized place with data that has good quality and that meets minimum regulatory requirements. So company, they can go there and basically have access to the data, compare their models to the data so we can have good benchmark there. So we have to have something like this. I totally agree, but in how we do it, there's a need for money and a lot of collaboration. We need the funds for this.
That's very true. Thanks a lot. And we will now continue with the second talk, but no worries, we will answer your questions afterwards. So now, Jean, the stage is yours.
Okay. Wonderful talk, Ghada. Okay. So we're switching gears a little bit. I am going to talk about how we think about performance decay and data shifts. And yeah, so like going beyond the benchmark data set and thinking about kind of what happens when we're trying to deploy. So same disclaimer as Ghada, whatever view they're mentioned here do not represent my funders. Okay, so many of you here are experts when you think in like AI benchmarking, where a lot of the main two activities in benchmarking involve development of the model and then validation of the model on the benchmark. What Ghada had been kind of talking about and what I will also be focusing on is kind of what happens after. So you've done benchmarking on some internal data set or some public benchmark. Now you're really thinking about how do I translate this into clinical practice. There's the deployment, the process of actually deploying that model into your target setting. For your target population. And then even after you deploy, there's still the long-term maintenance of the model. So you want to do some sort of monitoring to make sure that the model continues to perform well over time. And kind of as Ghada mentioned, the transition from going from that initial benchmarking or validation to deployment is actually extraordinarily difficult. And it's not just maybe like data issues, but there's also like logistical and infrastructure barriers oftentimes that that you need to overcome. For a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about today, I'm mostly thinking about kind of the statistical and algorithmic challenges, though I agree, like there's plenty of logistical things as well. So one of the kind of common things that come up is that performance when we do initial validation of these models might not actually match up to what we might expect when we actually deploy the model. So this is a paper out of Stanford that was very nice that talked about how even with the hundreds of FDA-approved medical devices, when they were reviewing them in 2021, they found that most of these devices were evaluated retrospectively and oftentimes on data from a single site. You'd be lucky to find a few. There are very few that actually validate their devices on multiple. And this can be a problem because, or this could be kind of a cause for concern because the performance of an AI algorithm often doesn't translate directly across different contexts. So if you deploy in a different setting, you would be concerned, sometimes even going from retrospective settings to prospective settings, even within the same site, you can find that there's differences in performance. So in this paper, this is not a real algorithm, but they were demonstrating that if they trained a AI model for detecting pneumothorax from chest x-rays, if they only trained it on data from the NIH, they would be, and then they validate on that data, they would find that the AUC is 0.88. But if they took that same algorithm to Stanford and they actually tried to test it out there, that AUC would drop very significantly. So this is just justification for why we want to make sure that we're evaluating these algorithms across kind of a representative setting of what that deployment setting will be like. And so cautionary tales like this pop up all the time, including algorithms developed for COVID-19 detection, as well as, I guess, in this example, detecting pneumonia. Okay, so that's just an example of kind of the challenges just going from that initial internal validation to that external setting, and you're trying to do this prospective deployment, but also going from deployment to monitoring, we also find issues, given that we know that performance of AI models often degrade over time because AI models, as Ghada had mentioned, are really trained on the data. And so if the data patterns are different in the current setting from when the model was originally trained on, the model can become outdated. So here's just like one example of many that demonstrated that, like, if you had a model, for instance, trained to predict emergency department admissions, what they found was that when they were initially evaluating the algorithm, that AUC was 0.85, but then COVID-19 hit, and so that AUC just drops quite precipitously. Okay, so our group has done quite a bit of research in this area of monitoring. We've published various papers discussing how, for instance, if you want to monitor a clinical AI algorithm and just kind of want to hit the ground running, there are a lot of methods out there that actually we can borrow from other fields. In particular, the field of quality assurance has a lot of methods. They use a lot of statistical control charts, statistical process control procedures, and these have been well utilized across like manufacturing. Like Toyota is very famous for using these types of algorithms, and we can actually borrow a lot of that technology to clinical AI as well. And then that was an older paper from 2022. And then more recently, we've kind of discussed how in our review of the clinical AI monitoring systems that have been published in the literature, there doesn't seem to be enough emphasis yet on kind of evaluating the power of these clinical AI monitoring systems. Developing a monitoring system is by no means easy. And so I think anyone who creates a robust monitoring system, or even just a monitoring system, should be commended. But I think we should not just rest on our laurels. Having a monitoring system is not necessarily a good monitoring system. So we want to also double check that these AI monitoring systems are working. Okay, so that's kind of monitoring, and I'm happy to talk about it offline. But actually, that's not going to be the focus for my talk today. What I actually wanted to talk about is what happens after monitoring. So there's this loop that we talk about in the AI model lifecycle, where after you monitor, if you find a problem, then you need to go back and update your model somehow. Or if you kind of, as I kind of mentioned, sometimes going from validation to deployment is already very difficult. And so maybe you find that there's some issue and you're not actually able to really deploy this and go to monitoring. So maybe you need to go from deployment back to development so that you can develop something that actually is ready. And so what do we do when we're trying to close this loop? And I don't think the practices here have been like fully fleshed out yet. A simple solution, and I think a kind of like a knee-jerk reaction, is like, well, let's just retrain the model, right? Like maybe we can collect more data. Maybe when you're monitoring, you find out something is not going well. So you just take the most recent slice of data and retrain your model. Maybe that will help. And so like when we think about or I guess like, and if we think about deployment, it's like maybe you initially internally validated on some data, but then in your deployment setting, that's a different hospital. Maybe we should just collect some new data from this new hospital and retrain a model. So like in some sense that will work. If you retrain a model for the specific context you are trying to deploy for, it should work, at least in the short term. And the nice part is there's not too much domain expertise. Like you can just take that model and just go, take the data and go. However, I think there's actually kind of significant downsides to just like blindly retraining models that we should kind of consider. In particular, of course, there's like non-zero costs and risks. If you're retraining a model, there's no necessarily a guarantee that it outperforms the original one. But I think the bigger concern I have is that retrained models might not actually be stable, right? So you've retrained it on that maybe on a specific data set, and that data set is representative of that specific setting at a specific time point. But whether or not that retrained model is going to work well for the next few years, that is still kind of unclear. You might have instead made the model actually more brittle. And that's what they found actually with like a lot of like the foundational AI models. If you fine tune too much, it's actually losing a lot of that generalizability kind of aspect. And so what I'm proposing is that actually, rather than just for retraining a model, maybe we take a step back before we decide on what exactly we want to do in terms of fixing up the AI system, and to really think about, like, can we figure out what the root cause is? If we can figure out why there is a shift, maybe we can find a more effective way to fix up an AI system. And so that might be a way to figure out, like, well, maybe it's not just the model itself that needs fixing. Maybe it's the data that needs fixing. So it kind of opens up the realm of possibilities in terms of like how we want to maintain these systems. So visually, I'm basically proposing this, like, before we jump right into model development, maybe we can think through this additional step of diagnosing what actually is going on. So I'm just going to briefly review kind of like what the major causes of performance shift are. And perhaps this is something that many of you already know about. And so I'll kind of go through this a little bit more quickly. If you're interested in more details, there's this textbook that's quite wonderful, a dataset shift in machine learning. And then there's the paper that Ghada actually had mentioned as well, Causality Matters in Medical Imaging. But for simplicity, let's just think about a very simple setting of like, what if our data is generated in this mechanism? So if you have baseline kind of features, this might be our medical image, X, and suppose that in our problem setting, X causes Y. And Y is some sort of outcome. Maybe you're trying to predict if the person's going to get flu the next year. And then domain here is the context. So what kind of like maybe the specific hospital or maybe the specific time point. And so domains can shift, right? So like you might be going from internal validation to external validation, or you might be going, you're kind of deploying your model over time. So there might be shifts over time. So that's what domain represents here. And then so given that, so domain has two arrows, right? So it can either influence X, our features to our model, or it can influence Y, whatever we're trying to actually predict. And when domain influences X, that's called a covariate shift. And so you might see that, okay, well, between like, say, two different hospitals, we see that the distribution of age is different. Or for imaging, maybe we have all these different image characteristics that end up differing, or kind of metadata about our image is differing. The problem with that, this does make it quite difficult though, because in this realm, in this world of AI, our features are very high dimensional. Sometimes they are images with thousands and thousands of pixels. And so like, if we're actually going to figure out what the, like in this type of setting, if there are so many features, probably all of them, or maybe many of them, differ across two domains. So it can actually be quite hard to deduce kind of which one of these features are really responsible for that performance shift. And so this kind of pops up again for the other arrow. So when domain influences the conditional distribution of Y, we also kind of may see this issue. If Y only depends on a few variables, maybe like to determine if someone has flu, we're looking at specific things. Maybe we can figure out, okay, well, one hospital really thinks about, I don't know, using cough to diagnose things, whereas another hospital really uses X-rays. But it's possible that many variables actually go into influencing Y, so it can be very difficult to figure out which of these variables are kind of responsible for that performance shift. So that is all to say, diagnosing why there is a performance shift is far from an easy problem. And so our group has been thinking a lot about like, how do we develop tools for this, as well as other groups in machine learning. The basic idea that many of these kind of tools have is that, well, let's start with just decomposing kind of the performance shift. So here, expectation with a subscript of 1 indicates the target domain, one of the domains, and then this expectation sub 0, that's the original domain, and you see some sort of performance difference. Let's say a difference in the expected loss, that's indicated by L. And usually we try to decompose that into this kind of aggregate level. So what is a performance difference attributed to the covariate shift? And then what is a performance difference attributed to the outcome shift? And more recently, our group has been thinking about, well, how do you actually kind of decompose that even further to say, well, which specific variables are contributing to this performance shift? So on the covariate shift side, which of these specific variables are really responsible? And then similarly on the outcome shift side, which of these variables are responsible? So you can think about it a little bit like variable importance, but for performance shifts instead. And then our most recent work has been thinking about it more from a hypothesis testing level viewpoint, as well as thinking about, well, performance shift actually doesn't happen just like to the average performance. Often you might even see no difference in average performance, but within subgroups, you can see that, oh, the performance can differ quite significantly. And in that case, what we want to know is not just who experiences large performance decay, so which subgroup has it, but also why is that happening. So this is a more fine-grained kind of framework for diagnosing performance drifts, and it's asking very similar questions. One, at the aggregate level, just at this high level, without thinking about specific variables, we're saying, okay, is there any subgroup where the performance difference due to, say, covariate shift is greater than 0, and similarly for outcome shift, and then we try to break it down into, okay, is there a subgroup whose performance differences can be explained by a covariate shift in a specific variable? Okay, so that's enough with the kind of methodological overview. What I wanted to really show is actually 2 applications that demonstrate why diagnosing performance shifts is really helpful in practice. And so at UCSF, I work with a bunch of clinicians who have developed AI algorithms, and they have been trying to deploy these things and often been kind of stymied by the fact that performance actually differs from what they were hoping it would be. So Julian Hong is a radiation oncologist at UCSF who does a lot of AI research as well. And he was originally a clinician at Duke, where he developed this algorithm for predicting acute care needs in radiation therapy for patients receiving radiation therapy. So he developed this gradient boosted tree. It was mainly on tabular data. And then they even ran a whole randomized clinical trial to demonstrate that when you deployed this algorithm at Duke, it really improved things. So the rate of patients needing acute care went from 22% down to 12%, which is very significant and impressive. So Julian moved from Duke at some point to UCSF, and then he was like, well, our model did great there. Can we use it at UCSF? And so at Duke, what they were finding was that the model had a PPV of 20%. And then when they went to UCSF and tried testing out this thing, they didn't even reach deployment. They found that the PPV dropped to 9%. And so our group has been collaborating with Julian to figure out, well, can we diagnose kind of what the reason is? And so using this, the hypothesis testing framework that our group recently developed, this was what we eventually found, which is, okay, this visualization is basically saying primarily we see a covariate shift, and we can also, our method also tells you, okay, which subgroup is experiencing a covariate shift. So what we found was actually this subgroup experiencing covariate shift was actually a 3% of the Duke population, whereas 34% in the UCSF population. And the variables that were most kind of important or biggest contributors to this performance shift were kind of the conditions of these patients and then maybe like ED utilization. And when we dug into this further, we found that, okay, indeed, this subgroup, they really differ in kind of in that the UCSF population has a lot more prostate cancer patients and related diseases. And these patients also tend to have lower ED utilization, which might explain why that also tends to be, why that feature was also flagged. And this gave us a really nice insight into, well, okay, how are we going to actually fix this thing? Do we really need to retrain the entire model? And our thought was probably not. Like, let's try not fix what isn't broken. Like, let's try to do a minimal fix so that we can maintain the model as much as possible, especially given that it went through RCT and demonstrated that it was very effective. Instead, rather than fully retraining the model, then what we did was we first said, okay, let's just have a wrapper around the original model. And this wrapper will first double check, is this patient in the detected subgroup? If they are in the subgroup that we found is very different from Duke, then we should have them go through a new model. But if they are actually quite similar to the original Duke population, they can go ahead and use the original model. So for this very limited update to the model, what we found was, surprisingly, actually, once you implement this, we can basically entirely close that performance gap in the PPV. And so here's just one last story. It's a similar type of story but now it's in this temporal setting. Andrew Bashara develops models to predict AKI, acute kidney injury. The model was originally developed on retrospective data, and then they want to go to prospective deployment or silent deployment. And big problem is that when we do that shift on EHR data, oftentimes you're moving across different databases. There's a live database, and then there's like a database that you can actually do analysis on that is used for retrospective data. And making the shift from databases often is kind of the cause of the problem. And so in this retrospective data set, they were finding a PPV of 40%, but during silent deployment, they were finding that PPV dropped to 13%. So using a similar diagnosis, we found, okay, labs and vitals differed a lot. There seems to be an outcome shift. And then if we actually pull up those specific variables, we found that actually is just a huge missing data problem. During the prospective setting, a lot of the features were actually missing. So the fix is actually very simple. There's not a need to retrain. All we need to do is, hey, ask the deployment team, can we double check that we're pulling the data correctly? And so through this fix, we also were able to significantly increase that PPV. It doesn't fully close that gap, so we're still looking into this issue, and we'll do another round of our diagnostics. But hopefully this is a demonstration of it's not just a model fix or blind model retraining. I think a very important step after we detect a problem in our models is to diagnose what went wrong before we figure out what corrective actions to take. Okay, so thank you everyone for listening. I also want to thank my team. We have a bunch of people at UCSF, as well as our collaborators at the FDA, as well as a few folks who are ex-FDA. And a final note, if any of you are postdocs or looking for a postdoc, I am hiring, so please check out this position. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Also really interesting perspective, what happens afterwards. And we have a couple of questions. I want to start with one directly for Jean. So how does the cycle of development, validation, deployment, monitoring, diagnosing, and redevelopment work from a regulatory standpoint, particularly the diagnosing and redevelopment steps after monitoring? Could you perhaps illustrate this with an example, something like a screening software?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm sure Ghada actually has a lot to say about this as well. So my understanding is that, well, there's usually like two different paths. So either the company or like the device developer has already had an agreement with the FDA that they have kind of plans to update the model, and that's outlined through a PCCP. So during the initial kind of clearance or approval of the device, they will have already submitted a PCCP. I forgot what the acronym means exactly. It's like pre-control plan or something like that. So you basically describe to the FDA in a document like these are our anticipated changes, maybe in response to like performance drift that you end up detecting. And if the FDA agrees to that plan, then in the future, you don't necessarily have to go through a very long regulatory process to make that change because it was already agreed upon. However, if you don't have a PCCP in place, then you would essentially need to make a new submission. And of course, you can say, okay, this is a modification of our original device. And then I think it would be, I've seen in regulatory documents where usually they would also request like, okay, for you to explain kind of like, why are you trying to make that change? And so diagnosis would actually be quite helpful in that setting as well. Great. Someone put in the chat, predetermined change control plan. Thank you.
And you said it very well, Jean. Like, once you lock your model, you cannot make any change. But one way to update your model is to develop a monitoring plan, and outline it in the PCCP. And if the FDA approve your plan, you can go ahead and implement this plan without going back to them.
Let me ask a question here also from the chat, which I think is interesting for all of us. How can a computer vision or machine learning researcher or student in a laboratory setting with access to raw medical data contribute to addressing all the concerns that both of you have mentioned?
So I will start. I think we need these very smart and genius like researcher to start to build better metrics that's really clinically aligned with what we want to achieve. A lot of the metrics we have today, they're built for the computer vision community. We need to build better metrics. We need to have metrics that integrate this really deep understanding of clinical task, clinical needs, clinical workflow, like the risk part. And we come with new metrics, new frameworks for evaluation, new frameworks for monitoring. I think Jean presented a lot of research problem, yes? This research problem that needs students to work on, like she's hiring. We need to keep doing innovation, but at the same time, we need to innovate for our field. We don't just take whatever was built for the computer vision field and apply it to our field. We need to adjust it. We need to understand the clinical need, the clinical task, and then build our methods, metrics, technologies based on this.
Yeah, and to chime in further, I think it's also very important to find like good collaborators who are who are like very invested in the translation, or like clinical collaborators who really understand the real world problems. Like just as an example, when I first left my PhD, I was like, oh, let's work on all these theory problems. Let's think about model updating in this very theoretical sense. And once I started working with the FDA, it was like, well, okay, half of those problems are not very interesting and not very realistic. And so you have to like really think through, okay, what are the questions that people need answered today? And I think that is actually very important to kind of understanding kind of what these real world challenges are.
And a little related, also the question, how do we get academia to reward work that is optimized for clinical translation rather than these standard comparisons to the state of the art?
Funding. I think basically funding agencies, they need to ask for deliverable that align with the problem that the grant they're trying to solve. Like, I think the deliverable right now is just papers, publications, which is good, but we need to ensure what these grants deliver is a tool or a method that's actually can be translated. I'm not talking about all grants. I'm talking grants that has the translational focus. Like, this is the only way I think that there's other ways, but if you have to deliver as part of your grants, that's something will actually work, like a new method, a new metrics, a new monitoring framework, then this is one way to do it. And collaboration. And these webinars, this discussion, we need to start to talk about it and shift the mindset and focus.
Yeah. And I guess like on top of funding, it would be like I think a lot of academia is focused on publications, but like that means like for, I don't know, giving more venues for publishing kind of papers describing how you actually achieve clinical translation. I think oftentimes we reward like state of the art or very theoretical papers, but kind of the real world challenges are also very important to, especially to disseminate the learning so that other people can kind of learn how they can achieve kind of similar results.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So we're a little over time, so if you need to leave, feel free to do so. We will upload the webinar afterwards, but if our speakers have a few more minutes, we can go through the remaining questions.
Yeah, I can stay.
Okay, perfect. Okay, next question. My current work focuses on developing a framework for evaluation medical data sets along the dimensions of quality, privacy, fairness, and compliance. From your perspective, what gaps in current FDA regulatory guidance should be addressed to better support such dataset level audits?
I don't think FDA, they have guidance for data, like for medical data set, I mean, I'm not sure, but I don't think there is a guidance for how to assess the quality of medical data set. But I do think they believe it's very important. Like if you read the recent AI guidance draft, there is a lot of discussion about understanding the characteristic of your data, the quality of your data, ensuring your data is fit for purpose, like for the purpose you want to use the data for. They mention the data card, which is one way to report the quality of your data, but I don't think there's like a specific guidance related to this.
I think one other, yeah, I'm sure Ghada knows the regulations better than I do. The one thing I will say is that our group has been kind of doing some research on like the public summaries of AI-based medical devices, and it's only like a 7 to 8 page, well, usually it's like 7 to 8 pages compared to the hundreds or even thousands of pages that are submitted for the original kind of approval from the FDA. And so like the 100-page document is not available to the public, but the 7-page one is. And there's like very little detail in the public summaries. And so like that makes it difficult to assess, at least from the public summaries, whether or not we trust the data sets or even if the validation is as comprehensive as what a user or a clinician would like. So I don't think that this directly answers your question, but I think it would be nice if there were more details in these public summaries. Because like there are papers such as like the James Zhao paper that I mentioned from Stanford that will say, oh, okay, most of these devices have been evaluated retrospectively on data from a single site. And that's actually only based off of the public summaries. And that might not be entirely accurate. Maybe there are other evaluations this company has done that they haven't revealed. But if we only judge things off of the public summaries, it does feel like, well, maybe we can do a lot better. So anyways, more transparency would be nice.
Yeah, definitely more transparency. And like I don't know like if there is now any requirement for to report, like to be more transparent about the data in the public summary. Like I don't know about this, but I do know this data quality is a huge focus for like the FDA. When I was working there, we had 2 projects just focusing on assessing quality of patient data, assessing quality of synthetic data. And they mention all of these dimensions in the chat: fairness, quality, privacy, compliance. We had a paper for synthetic data quality assessment. Those were part of this also. So research-wise, the agency, they're focusing on this. They believe it's important, but I don't think there is any actual guidance on this yet.
How would the PCCP plan capture dataset or population change?
So for the PCCP, like you mean how it can capture population change? Yeah. So one It can, like, if, for example, you want to include updating your model after deployment based on new data, like if your model started to drift because the population changed, then you can write this as a plan in your PCCP saying that once the model is deployed, it might be drifting due to population shift. And this is my plan to update the model. So you can do this. But you have to outline it very clear in your PCCP. And then if the FDA approve it, you can go deploy your model, collect more data. Then you can update your drifted model if the model is drifting because of the change in the population.
Yeah, so you have to explain kind of in the PCCP both how you're going to detect things, but and as well as how exactly you're going to fix things. Unfortunately, that all has to be pre-specified, and so you would only, if you're going to do a change outside of those, then you'll have to resubmit something.
Yeah. I know there is a lot of discussion when I was in MICCAI about like continual learning, and this idea of locked model is just so restricting, but I don't think we can. It's not there. Like FDA requires the model to be locked, and not just FDA, all regulatory agencies require your model to be fully locked. If you want to make any change, you can, not any change, but if you want to make a change, you can, but you have to specify this very clearly in your PCCP, explain why and how, and then if they approve it, you can do this. You can update your drifted model, you can collect more data. If you want to do something different than these two, like you have to submit another application.
What are strengths and gaps in how the FDA regulates health AI tools in clinical practice?
Like, I think the review process was scientifically driven, very comprehensive, very strong. Like I was working there, like I really think the reviewer, they're extremely smart, like they're like the best in their field. And it's very strong review process. But like again, like I don't know what different people like experience with the agency is. Based on my experience as someone worked there, I think it's very comprehensive and deep, and they try to cover all the aspects of the medical device.
I also think,
Yeah.
oh, go ahead.
I just want to say, if you want to ask anything, Jean, here.
I think the one thing is that I appreciate from the FDA is that I think the FDA knows that the area of regulating AI-based medical devices is still evolving. Like our understanding of how we should do it properly is totally, and there's still a lot of open questions, and like different countries are also talking together to think through like, okay, how do we align our policies? What are areas that we need to additionally look at? How do we deal with now generative AI? And I think there's a lot of opportunities for researchers to chime in. So like, for instance, right now, the FDA has a call for like feedback or like answers to questions about like, how should the FDA think about monitoring these AI tools? So yeah, I think like if you think there are gaps, actually the FDA is very willing to listen, and there are kind of channels to actually give that feedback.
Yeah, thank you, Jean, because I think a lot of people don't realize this. They're really open to listen. They are open to feedback. And if some of you read the last draft guidance, a lot of the things in the draft guidance are based on scientific research papers. So like they don't build guidelines based on just their understanding. They build it based on research, based on machine learning research paper, based on science. And they're open to talk with researchers, they're open to talk with scientists. Like, so if you have any feedback, just express your feedback, and I think they will take it into consideration. So that they're very open about it.
Awesome. And yeah, I have one, not really a question, more a comment. So someone said, I think referring to some of these questions about supporting academia, I think an industry-academia collaboration or guidance would help greatly. especially establishment of QMS early enough when we know that a solution can be productized.
I agree. I fully agree with this.
Awesome. Yeah, these were all the questions and comments we had, and we had 2 great talks, very interesting insights. So thanks again for being here, for presenting these interesting things that we all should consider more in our daily work. So I think if any of you have more questions, I think both of our speakers are very happy to answer them via email or any other source. Have a great day, and hopefully see you soon in one of the other webinars.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Annika. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.